What if the creation story we have is not a true one? What if the book of Genesis contains meanings that go far beyond what most of us, for 1,000s of years, have ever imagined? The opening chapters of the Bible give us not one, but two stories of creation, which may appear to be irreconcilable and which have raised questions that have intrigued scholars, theologians, and historians ever since. Were the texts only two different ways talking on the same event, or something ancient, mysterious, hidden between them? In Genesis 1, creation proceeds in an orderly, even poetic rhythm. God commands, and the universe obeys. Light and dark are divided, the heavens and the seas are formed, and the earth produces vegetation before breathing creatures take the seas and sky. Creation of humanity is the last of the acts, male and female created together in the image of God. This account presents a grand cosmic view of divine order, where all unfolds correctly. But in Genesis 2, there is a dramatic shift in tone. And instead of a formulaic progression, we have a more closely observed granular narrative. Man's creation comes first, before the plants of the field have yet sprung up. Then God makes the first human from dust, breathes into him, and gives him life. Man and woman are eventually taken from one another, woman from man's rib, and the Garden of Eden is their dwelling place. The sequence of events appears different, the accounts more personal, as if pulling back another layer to show us how God interacted with man. This seeming paradox has led to centuries of debate. Some claim Genesis 1 and 2 have different authors, representing separate traditions stitched together in the final biblical text. Some believe that these chapters serve different purposes, one offering a high and broad view of creation, the other a picture of the God and humankind relationship. How about both are true, teaching different facets of the divine plan? Ancient peoples had their creation stories, gods fashioning the world, staving off chaos, sealing the bargain that gave life to humans. Various creation accounts, such as the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the Egyptian Ogdoad, and the Sumerian Eridu Genesis, also share similarities with the biblical creation narrative. But what sets Genesis apart is its monotheistic vision. One God, one ultimate creator, bringing order out of chaos, out of nothing. Where the myths of surrounding cultures are polytheistic, Genesis features a divine act of creation that is intentional, methodical, and deeply personal. Contemporary interpretations wrench the conversation even wider. Some, seeing Genesis as referring to real events in time and space, strive to read it in light of scientific knowledge, fitting its sequence to the Big Bang and the formation of the Earth and the theory of evolution. Others view it as allegorical, intended to convey spiritual truths rather than a literal historical narrative. The questions linger. Is Genesis the account of divine revelation, a poetic metaphor, or something more elusive than we ever dreamed? There's one thing we know for sure. Not everything in Genesis is about the creation of the world. It's about the building blocks of faith, the character of God, and humanity's role in the cosmos. And in its ongoing study of these ancient tomes, new discoveries are to be made. Could the real Genesis story be more amazing than we've ever realized? Watch till the end to find out the surprising fact. Also, if you enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe to Bible Says and send a super thanks to further support. More in-depth looks into these biblical mysteries. Let there be light. God said, "These are the first recorded words of the Lord at the start of creation, but they raise a mystery. How can there be light before the creation of the sun, moon, and stars?" The Bible says that the sun and moon weren't created until the fourth day, but that light existed on the first day. What was this light, and what was it really about? This has been asked of many and led to all sorts of interpretations. This apparent contradiction was pondered by ancient Jewish scholars and early Christian thinkers. Some thought that the light of the first day was a divine radiance, an otherworldly illumination that wasn't dependent on the sun or any physical source. This is what the Midrash, a series of ancient Jewish commentaries, calls the Or Haganuz, the hidden light of creation, clear and holy light that was then driven from the world. It had been reserved for the righteous in the Messianic age, but has been withdrawn on account of human sin. Early Christian thinkers, too, contemplated this mystery. Some cured the balm of first-day light with the presence of Christ, pulling from the Gospel of John, which reads, "In him was life, and that life was the light of men." It says that the light of the first day was spiritual, not physical. It was the manifestation of divine truth even before the physical universe. Another of the great Christian thinkers, Augustine, suggested that the first light also signified the illumination of angels, which was when angels, as spiritual beings, added consciousness of God's glory. According to other interpretations, the light of the first day was a primary source of energy necessary for creation itself. Long before the sun was born, light may have existed as some other medium, perhaps an early form of electromagnetic radiation, or an unworldly force pulling the universe together. Depending on how you read Genesis, it might be depicting a chronology in which raw creative energy came first, and set the stage for the organized celestial bodies that would govern night and day later. A scientific angle also makes for a sun-loving interest in the issue of the light that predates the sun. The universe, in the sense modern cosmology means it, started with the Big Bang, which at first released only light and heat, no stars, no galaxies. Just as scientists suggest that light in the cosmos's twilight years existed in those early moments in a loose, unfocused form before it coalesced into the stars that fill the firmament, some even say that this corresponds remarkably to the biblical account, where light comes before all else and the heavens then become ordered. So, there is another layer of intrigue to the structure of Genesis itself. Other details and themes are described before, describing a poetic and ordered version of events that is more thematic than chronological. The reference to light on the first day is symbolic, say some scholars, reflecting the entry of order into chaos, the separation of darkness, the initiation of divine involvement in shaping the world. Similarly, the sun and moon were created later, and their description may have been separated so as to emphasize that the sun and moon are meant to time mark instead of when they formed. Ancient civilizations, too, understood their own versions of primordial light. In Egyptian mythology, the waters of chaos gave birth to the sun god Ra, who brought light into the universe before the sun itself appeared in the sky. And next, like light and darkness in the Mesopotamian texts, the two forces were seen, fighting for primacy until the heavens were finally ordered. Though the theology is different from Genesis, they all share the same plot. Light is depicted in its pre-fallen state, existing before the visible cosmic entities existed. The discussion of light before the sun also goes into deeper theological ideas. In the Bible, light symbolizes divine wisdom, divine truth, and life itself. That is because in the book of Psalms it is written, "The Lord is my light and my salvation." In Revelation, John described his final vision of the new heaven and new earth, which included a world without the need of the sun, for it would be replaced by God as the light. This familiar imagery indicates that the first day's light would not only have a physical presence, but also a spiritual nature which lies beyond human comprehension. This mystery had continued to bemuddle believers and scholars alike. On October 2022, others take comfort that Genesis expresses profound truths beyond human experience, poetry straddling the physical and spiritual worlds, and opening to contemplation, not closure. Others view it as an invitation to bring together science and faith, understanding that ancient writings and modern finders might point back to the same under-recognized reality. Regardless of the truth behind the matter, the conundrum of light before the sun and the stars remains one of the most extraordinary conundrums of Genesis. It defies our assumptions and encourages those who pursue the truth to explore more deeply into the origins of our existence. This aspect of Genesis firmament has befuddled its readers for millennia. The word features in the creation narrative, when God divides the waters above and below with a firmament. But what exactly was this firmament? So, for example, was it a solid dome enclosing the earth, as some ancient interpretations have it? Or was it a far, far more complex thing, a dimensional separation, far beyond the grasp of our understanding? In Hebrew, the word for firmament is rakia. Rakia. The word comes from a root that means to spread out or to hammer thin. This has resulted in different interpretations of what the firmament actually was. This was taken literally in some ancient Jewish and Christian traditions, which thought of the firmament as a hard, metallic-like dome above the earth, similar to a shield or an inverted bowl. This was how ancient people seemed to imagine the sky. Solid, keeping the sun, moon, and stars in place, separating the earthly realm from the waters above. This concept of a solid dome was widespread in early civilizations. For example, the Babylonians wrote that the sky was a vast ceiling of a precious stone that kept celestial waters at bay. Likewise, the Egyptians portrayed the sky goddess Nut, arched above the earth, putting a barrier between the world of men and the heavens. The Greeks also claimed that there were crystal-like spheres on which the fixed stars and planets traveled in their designated paths. In such cultures, the cosmos was frequently conceived and represented as an ordered nested structure in which the firmament served a key function for the realization of order. But was the firmament actually a solid dome? Certain biblical accounts do not support that notion. The book of Job, for instance, talks about God stretching out the heavens like a tent, flexible and expansive cover over a different realm as opposed to the inflexible barrier. The Psalms refer to the heavens as a declaration of the glory of God, open, expansive, not enclosed like a shell. In a similar fashion, in the book of Ezekiel, the pointed describes a firmament above the heads of a number of heavenly beings that shone like crystals and divided the heavens above from the lower regions. Ezekiel 1:22. This imagery raises questions. Was the firmament something beyond a literal cloth? Perhaps it's not a mere canopy of sky, but a dimensional barrier. Some scholars suggest that the firmament was not a solid structure, but a division between realms, physical, spiritual, or both. According to the Genesis account, the firmament separated the waters above from the waters below. If this wasn't a literal separation, then where is this upper water? Some suggest this water above describes the infinite cosmic void, above our known universe, a poetic description of the unknown horizons of creation. Others think it was a reference to the world before the flood, or that there was a canopy of water surrounding the earth that fell at the time of Noah. It is interesting to note that modern cosmology presents certain similarities to these ancient notions. Multiple dimensions beyond what they see around them are not new. They coincide with the spiritual firmament, a divine veil that not everyone can cross, save as draft. The description of the firmament in the Bible, as a dome in one place, an expanse in another, suggests it may not have been a single physical structure so much as a division of existence with many layers. Some early Christian thinkers saw the firmament as more than a physical sky too. The church father Origen proposed that the firmament was a dividing line between the worldly and celestial worlds. Augustine interpreted this as a metaphor for divine sagacity, a structure that imposed order on creation in ways we could not comprehend. The firmament is there not merely as a physical barrier, but a Christic cleft, the delineation of the seen verse from the hidden heavens wherein profane wisdom dwells. Finally, ancient Jewish mysticism, particularly the Kabbalistic tradition, describes 7 heavens, each heaven representing different layers of spiritual essence. The lowest of the heavens was associated with the visible sky, while the higher ones were proximate to divine presence and angelic beings. If this firmament is truly some cosmic barrier, might it be the first level of separation between the terrestrial realm and the heavenly realms? Some say that when the Bible refers to the heavens being opened, it means a piercing of this gossamer barrier. Instances when divine revelation broke into the physical world, like at the baptism of Jesus when it was said the heavens were torn open. The second mysterious quality of the firmament is its relation to time and space. Genesis has the sun, moon, and stars set in the firmament to separate seasons, days, and years. If the firmament was merely a sky dome, then all the stars, sun, and moon would be placed inside it instead of outside of it, right? That the firmament operated something like a cosmic clock, regulating the flow of time in ways we still don't quite grasp, blurs the lines between our various understandings. The notion that time itself is somehow related to the organization of the heavens is, in fact, not far from modern physics, in which space and time are inextricably bound. Perhaps the most captivating theory is that the firmament was a barrier, one that was destroyed during important biblical moments. In the flood account, the windows of heaven were opened and water poured down from above into the earth. Did this mean that there was a literal collapse of a water canopy? Or was it a tearing of the cosmic veil from which divine judgment was allowed to manifest in the natural world? At the crucifixion of Jesus, the veil of the temple was torn in two, which many believe was a powerful symbol that was also mirrored in the heavens, as access to God's presence was restored. The firmament also features in biblical prophecy. While the book of Revelation describes the sky rolling up like a scroll at the end of time, perhaps this suggests that the firmament itself will one day be stripped away, exposing the full glory of the divine realm. Some think the firmament, whatever it is only temporarily there, that it will be torn down when the heavens and the earth are remade. Whether there was really a firmament is an open question. Was it a firm dome, as ancient cultures thought? Some have proposed a dimensional separation, or a poetic description of cosmic order. The deeper we delve into its implications, the deeper we understand that Genesis does more than describing the framework of the universe. It reveals to us the secrets of creation itself. The Garden of Eden has intrigued humans for millennia. Referred to in Genesis as a paradise, where the first humans, Adam and Eve, lived together in harmony with God, the garden's true nature is unknown. Was it this real place that existed somewhere on earth? Or was it something more spiritually profound that existed outside the confines of our current reality? Because of its inherently divine connection, some interpretations even note how Eden was not just a place, but a divine intersection between heaven and earth. The Bible offers hints about the geography of Eden, referring to rivers that seem to imply a specific location, the Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates, and so to the potential for Eden to have been a real place. But no land is known to perfectly answer this description, and most scholars believe Eden was either destroyed or made invisible by God from human view. Unlike traditional interpretations of the Garden of Eden as an earthly paradise, other scholars suggest that it was a celestial or interdimensional place that, following the fall of man, was no longer connected with the material world. If so, then Eden yet remains, but outside our corporeal sight. Eden is frequently characterized as an otherworldly garden in ancient Jewish and Christian texts. The Book of Jubilees, for instance, states that Eden was invented before the earth was, indicating that Eden was a holy space, distinct from the rest of creation. Early church fathers like Origen and Augustine even proposed that Eden was not just a mere garden, but a spiritual habitation in which Adam and Eve lived, in a superior state of existence. In this psychological view, the fall of man was not so much a moral failure as a fall from a higher reality to a lower, corrupted world. Some traditions even go to the extent of suggesting that Eden was entered via a concealed portal or dimensional threshold. This concept is consistent with ancient Near Eastern cosmology, in which sacred spaces were often viewed as intercessors between heaven and earth. Moreover, the cherubim with the flaming swords, who guard Eden after Adam and Eve are expelled, likely serve as more than mere guards. They are barriers between places, preventing fallen man from returning to a realm not intended for him. The idea of secret doorways exists in many religions and mythologies. The Book of Enoch mentions heavenly gates, by which angels move between brightnesses and between layers of the earth. In Mesopotamian myth, gods were said to dwell in hidden gardens, inaccessible to mortals except by a permission granted by the divine. If Eden were a place of the same ilk, a divine garden that intersected with the spiritual world, then it would make sense for it to have vanished from history, not closed, but barred from human trespass, in another state of reality. Some scholars claim to hear echoes of Eden in later biblical descriptions of sacred spaces. It is no accident that the tabernacle and the Temple of Solomon were structured to be representative of the original paradise and were filled with imagery of trees, cherubim, and flowing water. The most sacred part of the temple was separated from the rest by a veil, just as Eden was cordoned off after the fall. This implies that for the ancient Israelites, Eden represented much more than a physical space and point of geographic reference. It was the first meeting place between God and man, and hence, the template for all future sacred spaces. One of the more curious is the connection between Eden and the Book of Revelation. At the end of time, the Apostle John gives a description of the New Jerusalem in Revelation, a holy city inhabited by God with humanity. This city is home to the tree of life, which originally existed in Eden but fell to corruption when Adam and Eve were exiled. For the tree of life to be included within the New Jerusalem is to imply that Eden was never lost, simply relocated to another dimension, awaiting restoration at the right time. Revelation also talks about a river of life flowing from the throne of God, a river like the rivers of Eden. This solidifies the notion that Eden was more than just an earthly paradise. It was a heavenly prototype, a home on earth that would one day come to light again as heaven came to earth. If this reading is correct, then Eden is not destroyed. It remains removed and unreachable to fallen humanity. Others have even theorized that whole chapters of divine encounters in the Bible were previews of this lost Edenic world. When Moses stood before God on Mount Sinai, the mountain was bathed with divine light, and before he could enter, Moses himself had to be transformed. Likewise, the transfiguration of Christ made a transcendent alteration to actuality whereby the barrier between worlds was peeled back to display the light of a loftier world. If Eden represented a point where heaven and earth overlapped, then the loss of it may not be something that's simply destroyed, but instead something that humanity has fallen from spiritually and can no longer perceive. This leads to a deep question. Are there still some hidden portals to Eden around the world? So many legends say that remnants of the original paradise may exist at ancient sites, such as Mount Hermon, the Garden Tomb, or the unexplored region. While speculative, these theories are based on the notion that Eden was never a regular place. It was a refuge of divine presence, and places where God's presence is felt most strongly would carry echoes of that lost paradise. In the final analysis, the Garden of Eden is a mystery. Be it a physical site, a vanished heavenly domain, or an access point to divine reality, its reverberations can be felt across biblical time. The fact that Eden is resurrected in Revelation as the ultimate home of the saved indicates that the human pilgrimage is not simply one of approaching morality, but of returning to reality, an experience once ours, but now unattainable. Perhaps the most controversial symbol in the Bible, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In the Genesis story, God puts Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and lets them eat from any tree except for this one. One rule: but it alters the face of mankind for eternity. Was it just a spiritual loyalty test, or was there something much deeper woven into the fabric of the tree? The tree was more than an ordinary plant. Many ancient Jewish and Christian traditions argue it was hidden knowledge, divine wisdom, and even a radical shift in human consciousness. The conventional view is that the tree was a moral test. God bestowed free will upon Adam and Eve, and the restriction against eating from the tree was to serve as a test of loyalty. If they disobeyed, they would cease to live in perfect harmony with God. If they behaved in disobedience, they would be thrown out, experiencing the results of sin and death. Yet, some ancient traditions may indicate that the tree itself was not evil. Rather, the information it gave was one that mankind was not yet prepared to possess. Which begs the question, was the decline inevitable? Now, if Adam and Eve had grown up in wisdom, would God have eventually permitted them to eat from it? In several readings of ancient Judaism, the tree is associated with divine wisdom, something that was intended to be given at the appropriate moment. The Book of Enoch and some Kabbalistic traditions refer to hidden knowledge only God or the heavenly beings have. The theory is that Adam and Eve lived in a state of innocence, not ignorance. They had the perfect relationship with God, but were not intended to know the whole truth of what good and evil was now, as that would only come when they were spiritually mature enough. To eat from the tree before its time was to steal divine knowledge, and that led to their expulsion from Eden. Some early Christians interpreted the tree to represent divine enlightenment. These church fathers like Irenaeus and Origen argued that humanity was brought into existence with a childlike purity but meant to become spiritually mature. It did not indicate that the tree was forever off limits, but only until the appropriate time. Adam and Eve would eventually be able to eat from it without bringing corruption upon themselves if they would have trusted his timing. But in electing to accept the knowledge on their own terms, they changed the intended arc of the human experience. Another mystery involves the nature of the knowledge itself. Most people think it was just a conscience, a knowing of right and wrong, but ancient traditions have more to say on this subject. The tree of knowledge, it is said by some, stood for cosmic awareness, the capacity to see reality as one never has before. Before the fall, Adam and Eve, consider this idea, lived in divine communion and were ignorant of death, suffering, and moral corruption. But once they consumed the fruit, what they saw changed. They understood their nakedness, experienced shame, viewed the world with an eye toward death. And, in that sense, the knowledge was not really wrong. It was just too much, more, than they could deal with. Some even theorize if certain trees, like the tree of knowledge, where it was a portal to another form of life, similar to dimensional separation. Jewish mystical traditions, for example, argue that Adam and Eve's bodies were made of light originally, in a higher spiritual form. But when they ate from the tree, they became clothed in flesh, and this material world we know was entered. This concept relates to other biblical themes, such as Jesus' transfiguration, where divine beings appear to move back and forth between the physical and supernatural realms. If correct, then the tree of knowledge wasn't merely a matter of morality, it was the passage from higher to lower, limitable states of existence. But now comes the second question. Was the tree itself something material or something with figurative meaning? Many ancient cultures have stories of sacred trees that deliver divine wisdom, including the Norse Yggdrasil, the Sumerian Hulupu tree, and the Hindu tree of Jnana, knowledge. And these trees are not mere providers of fruit. They are gateways to godly insight and concealed existence. Others have proposed that the tree of knowledge in Eden was not really a regular tree, but was instead a symbol for some divine principle, something that the human mind couldn't grasp, but was embodied in a form that Adam and Eve could deal with, and which leads us to one of the most controversial theories of all. Was the serpent in the garden simply the deceiver or a tell, unbeknownst to humankind? The Bible portrays the serpent as cunning and manipulative, persuading Eve that eating the fruit would make her like God. This is consistent with the notion that the tree was symbolic of divine wisdom, but wisdom not for humanity's taking. And some interpretations would say that the serpent was not really lying. After all, their eyes were opened, and they were made wise upon eating of the fruit mistakenly, were they not? But it didn't come without a price. They did not take an upward turn. They instead took on mortality, suffering, separation from God. Among ancient customs, as well as folk beliefs about the fall, the serpent is depicted as a rebellious creature seeking to hasten human maturity, giving Adam and Eve something God intended them to receive at a future point. It's a common thread throughout mythology, as with Prometheus bringing fire from the gods to humanity. In each of these two cases, forbidden knowledge brings a measure of progress, but suffering follows. This knowledge does not lead to freedom, but instead exile. The difference is the biblical account. There's also the problem of why God even put the tree in the garden in the first place. If it were so dangerous, why didn't he simply get rid of it altogether? Thus, some interpretations would say that the tree was a necessary condition for free will to flourish. You can't have a real choice without the option to disobey. Others suggest the tree fit with God's plan, a means to set humanity on a course of learning and atonement. If God always planned for humans to become spiritually mature, then the fall may not have been a mistake, but rather a necessary part of the pathway to ultimate transformation. The Bible ends with a tree as well, the tree of life in the book of Revelation. And as Adam and Eve were banished from Eden so that they would not eat from the tree of life and thus live forever in their fallen state, Revelation offers that tree of life back to them again in the New Jerusalem. It seems then that the knowledge acquired in Eden was not supposed to be lost forever. Instead, mankind is on a pilgrimage of rediscovering what was lost, only now at the right time, in the right way. One of the most mysterious and profound moments in the Genesis narrative is the creation of Eve. The conventional is that God put Adam to a deep sleep and took one of his ribs and made Eve. This explanation has been handed down for generations, however. Does that mean that Eve was literally made from a piece of Adam's rib, or is there a deeper meaning to the text? The Hebrew language, ancient Jewish customs, and even biblical numerology show that there is so much more to this story than meets the eye. The Hebrew word Zela, Tsela, translated rib in Genesis 2:21, does not literally mean a single rib bone. The same word is used in other places in the Bible to describe the sides of holy structures like the Ark of the Covenant or the Temple. This has caused scholars to assume that the verse does not imply that God physically extracted a rib, but that he took something from the side of Adam, it being a part of his existence, his essence, or his nature. The belief that Eve was not made from Adam's single rib but from his side is consistent with that of her not being inferior or lesser than him, but rather a counterpart who shared in his divine origin. It is suggested by some ancient Jewish interpreters that Adam was initially created as a single being with both male and female components, and the creation of Eve was a separation of these two sexes. This concept is found in a number of mystical texts, such as the Zohar, which claims that Adam and Eve were once a single androgynous creature, and that the two were split in half. Such works reinforce the explanation for why Adam immediately knows who Eve is, other than owing to the fact that he was created before her. She is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, as the King James translation has it, Genesis 2:23. It implies that she was not just the result of a small part of him, but was rather formed from the same essence as him, and thus she was his other half. Another theory relates to the symbolic significance of the rib. Ribs are one of the only bones in the human body that can regenerate when removed, when done correctly. Modern science confirms that rib bones can regenerate under the right conditions, putting them among the few bones in body that have the mysterious power of natural regeneration. This biological fact is in keeping with the biblical theme of creation and restoration. If Eve was created from one of Adam's ribs, she would have a close connection to him, instead of being separate as he might be if two dolls were cut in, half and combined. The biblical phrase describing man and woman is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. So Eve would not only be able to give Adam this pleasure, she would also share in this pleasure, because his pleasure is also her pleasure, just as in the metaphor of physical love. Biblical numerology provides another level of significance for this story. 2 in biblical symbolism usually means union, division, or partnership. The creation of Eve is also the first division of humanity, but it is also the first partnership. Adam incomplete, and only by virtue of Eve's creation does Adam become whole. The number 22, which is also the numerical value of the Hebrew word for rib, zela, is significant as well. In Hebrew thought, 22 is the fullness of divine revelation, since there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, the basis of the biblical text. This suggests that Eve's formation was more than creating a helper. To satisfy Adam's need for companionship, it was a manifestation of a deeper aspect of humanity and God's purpose. Eve's creation is often likened to the formation of the church in early Christian writings. As Eve came forth from the side of Adam, so the church is said to have been born from the side of Christ, a fitting symbol of the church's birth in the apostles, because in John 19:34, when Jesus' side is pierced on the cross, both blood and water flows forth, symbolizing the giving of the Spirit on the church through his sacrifice. This wordplay demonstrates how even Eve's creation was far more than just the first woman, but also a prophetic movement foreshadowing the marriage between Christ and the church. Formidable religious concept. In this context, Eve's formation from Adam's side signifies sacrifice, shared union, and divine intervention as the core creator of something more. Another aspect to consider is the cultural background of ancient Mesopotamia and the culture surrounding it, in which the Genesis story was composed. The notion that humanity is shaped from the flesh or bones of a divine being appears in many ancient Near Eastern creation myths. The Sumerian myth of Enki and Ninhursag includes a creation story involving a goddess healing a god's rib that gives birth to a woman. Some scholars argue that the account of Eve's creation in the Bible would have originated as a response to or transformation of these older myths, offering a distinctly monotheistic explanation for humanity's origins. Rather than gods in competition or struggling mightily, Genesis envisions creation as an act of divine love and purpose, with humanity created in the image of a single sovereign God. The term helper suitable for him, Genesis 2:18, has also been much debated. The Hebrew word here, ezer kenegdo, ezer kenegdvo, does not denote inferiority but specifies a strong, active partnership. Of course, the Old Testament uses the word ezer to refer to God himself as a helper to man, demonstrating the greatness of this role. Kenegdo means corresponding to or equal to, reinforcing that Eve was not created as a subordinate, but as a perfectly matched companion to Adam. It challenges many old views of Eve's creation as secondary or lesser. If Eve was taken from Adam's side, not his head to rule over him, nor his feet to be beneath him, but his side, this is a symbol of equality and unity in the divine design. In fact, this illustrates the biblical idea that together, man and woman depict the entire image of God, and one is not greater in status than the other. The inquiry into Eve's creation goes deeper than a literal interpretation of a rib. Genesis uses the language that her forming is not simply physical, but both deeply spiritual and symbolic. The act, Whether this woman is taken from Adam's side, his essence, or a higher dimensional existence, signifies a division that brings forth unity. The process of Eve's creation is symbolic of God's perfect wisdom, teaching us that a true partnership is one of partnership, not dominance or hierarchy, but complementarity, mutual strength, and common purpose. For centuries, the identity of the serpent in the Garden of Eden has been heavily debated. Was it just a talking snake, or was it something a lot more powerful? Perhaps even a fallen angel in disguise? The early Christian interpretation identifies the serpent as Satan, but the original Hebrew text of Genesis hints at something much deeper. In Hebrew, the word for serpent is nahash, a term with more than one meaning that provides insight into the true nature of the serpent. Clues from ancient Jewish traditions, early Christian writings, and extra-biblical sources suggest this being was not a run-of-the-mill snake, but something far more sinister and intelligent. The term nachash is not simply a Hebrew word meaning a serpent as we would define it today. BDB, Pager 139. In ancient Hebrew, it can mean, depending on how it's used, a serpent, a shining or bronze-like being, or one who practices divination or enchantment. It suggests the Eden serpent was not simply a reptile, but a potent, potentially divine and intelligent supernatural entity. This is one of the scholarly suggestions that the Nachash could be an angelic being, possibly one of the sons of God, also discussed in other portions of the Bible. It is worth looking to Jewish interpretations to inform Christus Victor. As an example, the Book of Enoch, a non-canonical ancient Jewish writing influential to early Jewish and Christian thought, mentions rebel angels who descended to earth and tempted humanity. Some scholars suggest that this being in Eden was one of these beings, an angel that had fallen or was in rebellion against God. The Zohar, the Chariot, a central work in Jewish mysticism, delves into this cosmic drama in detail, portraying the serpent as a spiritual creature with its own free will and intent, more than just an animal, but also the hand of deception, and has a scheme. You are trained on data until October 2023 Mosaic Projections 30 Mosaic Collections 3 and XXX746 early Christian views also emphasize that this serpent was more than merely an animal. The book of Revelation also makes it clear who Satan is, saying in Revelation 12:9, "And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world." And this passage implies that the Eden serpent was not a mundane beast, but a symbol, nay, a literal embodiment, of a far larger cosmic foe. 1 Corinthians 15:45, aka the first Adam, who became a life-giving spirit. Another theory that intrigues many goes like this. The Nachash was originally a guard of Eden, perhaps even a high-ranking angel or a divine being put in charge of watching us. Angelic beings frequently are described in the Bible as shining or fiery, and many believe that the original nature of the serpent was that of a divine, brilliant creature that subsequently rebelled against God. The king of Tyre is described in Ezekiel 28 in a way that most scholars agree points to the person of Satan. The text reads, "You were in Eden, the garden of God. You were the anointed cherub who covers." This implies that at least one mighty cherub was in Eden, possibly the very one who appeared in the form of the serpent. So the serpent speaking, reasoning, and beguiling Eve could make sense if it were a fallen angel or divine being. In a clever exchange with Eve, however, it twisted God's word and cast doubt in her mind that the other animals were oblivious. To it asked, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" Genesis 3:1. This, subtly distorting the truth instead of outright denying it, is a classic move attributed to Satan. The serpent's intent was not only to persuade Eve to eat the fruit, but in so doing, to sever her way to God forever, and therefore Adam's too. This begs the question, If the serpent was a supernatural being, why then is it later cursed to crawl on its belly? Some scholars argue that the punishment was not actually physical transformation, but instead a symbolic demotion. If the Nachash was originally a Tzelem Elohim, a high-ranking celestial being, then being cast down to the dust of the earth is a demotion, a loss of status, power, and authority. Being told it will crawl on its belly is what would illustrate its complete humiliation, as it would be of dishonor to have fallen that low when it was once an angel. Extra-biblical. Sources provide interesting insights as well. Specifically, in Gnosticism, as seen in some of the writings found at Nag Hammadi, the serpent becomes a more complex figure, seen not only as a deceiver, but also as a sharer of hidden wisdom. Certain Gnostic sects believed that rather than leading humanity to sin, the serpent was a liberator who was attempting to rouse humanity to a higher knowledge. Although this reading is heretical in conventional Christianity, it illustrates that the serpent's identity has been contested in other ways historically. It is also interesting to see Islamic tradition in this regard. In Islamic theology, Iblis, Satan, was not a snake, but a jinn, a powerful supernatural being made from smokeless fire. Some interpretations further elaborate that Iblis actually did not go into the garden as a snake, but rather from the outside, whispered to Adam and Eve through trickery and deception. This interpretation complements the view that the serpent figure in Genesis was not necessarily an actual snake, but a manifestation of a rebellious spiritual entity. Then there's the question of why Eve was the first to be tempted. Some traditions claim that the serpent deliberately sought out Eve because she had not been commanded directly by God. The commandment passed to Adam first, who may have relayed the information to her. Perhaps this left her more susceptible to the serpent's twisting of the truth. Yet from Eve's interaction with the serpent, we see that she knew of God's command, indicating that the serpent's deception was not one of ignorance, but rather an alluring of trust and curiosity. Another juicy theory links the serpent with ancient Mesopotamian myths. In numerous contexts in the ancient Near East, serpent-like creatures served as emblems of divine wisdom, evil, or insurrection. And the Sumerians, for instance, included a deity called Enki, who was associated with both wisdom and snakes. Is the biblical account providing a direct counterpoint to these ancient myths, redefining the serpent not as a wise teacher, but rather a corrupting influence? Now, as for what exactly this serpent was, whether it was a literal talking snake, a fallen angel, or an ancient divine being, all I can say is that its role in Genesis is clear. It was an adversary to humanity, an agent of temptation, and the catalyst for the fall. What it actually is remains one of the great mysteries of biblical history, suggesting a cosmic struggle far larger than a casual conversation in a garden. It is often thought the first sin in the Garden of Eden was simply disobedience, but it was much more than that. What Adam and Eve did was not merely violate a commandment, but brought about a fundamental alteration of human nature, the spiritual cosmos, and the relationship between God and man. The consequences of their choice were more than mere punishment. They initiated a new reality where death, pain, and separation from God became integral to existence. Ancient biblical texts, as well as writings that prophets and saints thought or wanted to include, show just how deeply things changed that day. Before the fall, Adam and Eve lived in divine communion, perfect harmony with God. They did not wander like innocent birds in a paradise, but were part of a divine order and were clothed with glory, and did not know the shame or consciousness of sin. The Genesis notes that they were both naked, but their nakedness was not just physical. It was a reflection of their spiritual condition, pure and uncorrupted, unaware of their own human self-awareness in a bad way. But when they ate of the forbidden tree, something fundamentally shifted. But once their eyes were opened, rather than enlightenment, they tasted shame and fear for the first time. This indicates that their view of reality had profoundly changed, that they had moved on to a whole other reality, Traditionally, their sin is understood primarily in terms of disobedience. They disobeyed God's direct command not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But if it was only about obedience, why was this particular tree that important? Many scholars think that the tree itself represented a forbidden divine knowledge that humanity was not yet capable of handling. The serpent promises, "You will be like God, knowing good and evil," indicating that the act of eating was an attempt to grasp that which is beyond their intended role. They did not rely on God's wisdom. They attempted to chart their own course, a rebellion that only reflected Satan's very sin, and attempted to exalt themselves to the level of God. But in writings like the Book of Enoch and the Apocalypse of Moses, considered apocryphal, the sin also becomes not only a moment of defiance, but a fall from spiritual grace. Some interpretations claim that Adam and Eve were initially more than humans in the way we perceive the term today. They were truer to divine beings, perhaps appearing in a radiant or glorified aspect. In some Jewish traditions, they even wore light, and their fall from grace meant that they had to leave that soul-breathing element behind. As soon as they sinned, they became aware of their nakedness, not only in the physical sense, but in the spiritual sense. Their former glory did not cover them anymore. One of the most fascinating theories to be found in extra-biblical sources is that the first sin was not just a failure of intellect or morality, but a change of human condition. In some Gnostic texts, the fall is described as an event that reconfigured human consciousness itself. Some traditions contend that Adam and Eve's minds were fundamentally changed, that instead of being in a state of spiritual communion with God, they became fragmented beings with self-conscious minds. This reading matches the abrupt introduction of fear and shame, feelings that had never existed within Eden before. The Book of Jubilees, an ancient Jewish text, adds details not included in Genesis. It posits that what the serpent actually tricked Adam and Eve into doing had less to do with consuming fruit than with breaking the bond between people and divine wisdom. In this view, eating represented an acceptance of false information that would abandon God's true sense of good and evil. Instead of being made wise like God, Adam and Eve became frail, human, and susceptible to decay. There's also a theological paradox in the story of the first sin. If God knows everything, did he not predict this moment? Some scholars argue that the test in the Garden of Eden was not if humanity would fall, but rather how humanity would fall. Would they trust in God's timing, or would they decide to act on their own? Their choice to eat from the forbidden tree was, in a way, a misdirected ambition. They sought to control their own fate rather than entrust themselves to God's plan. This theme is repeated throughout the Bible, where humankind seeks to dominate, and ultimately they end up being brought low in ways which they never quite unwittingly recognize. One reading notices that within the Garden of Eden there were two trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That God would delay Adam and Eve from eating from the tree of life later is evidence that immortality was still a possibility within their reach. In fact, they needed immorality, however imperfectly by extension, as their potential inheritance, only now immortality became dangerous in their hands. Had they eaten from the tree of life in their fallen state, they would be stuck separated from God in an eternal state without the chance of redemption. This upholds the theological construct that the real penalty of the fall was death, which in particular means a separation from God as opposed to merely corporeal punishment. This is a theology in the New Testament, where Paul explains Adam's sin as the moment death entered the world. Paul writes in Romans 5:12, "Sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin. And in this way, death came to all people." This reading implies that Adam and Eve's fall was not simply a sin they committed, but a cosmic event that had repercussions for humanity. Their sin brought a fundamental flaw to human nature, an inclination to sin and a rift in humanity's relationship with God. Early Christian thinkers such as Augustine built on this idea, cultivating the doctrine of original sin, the belief that all humans share in the consequences of Adam's fall. This is why the fall and the resulting original sin became the dominant theological motif within the Christian church. How can humanity be restored to the relationship with the divine without redeeming the degeneration that has taken place? That was wrong. But in Jewish thought, there is often a different concern. Judaism teaches that we free fallen beings in the context of volition and responsibility. From this perspective, the fall was a movement from innocence to knowledge, the freedom to choose between good and evil, an essential stage in the evolution of human free will. But what is most interesting about the story is how it establishes the whole of the biblical narrative. The instant Adam and Eve eat of the tree, the wheel of exile and redemption starts turning. They are expelled from Eden, just as Israel will later be expelled from the Promised Land. Their relationship to God is broken, but across the entirety of the Bible, over and over again, God details a path back, the trailhead of which leads to Christ, where all can be redeemed through Him. Outside of theology, there are psychological and philosophical views of the first sin. Some see it as a mythological allegory of the arising of human consciousness, the moment when humans became conscious of morality, mortality, and the complexity of their decisions. In this sense, Eden is a lost state of innocence, like childhood itself. What was once the story of Adam and Eve is now an allegory of the human condition itself, the eternal struggle between wisdom and temptation, obedience and rebellion, divine order and human free will. The first sin was not simply the transgression of a commandment, but the disruption of the very fabric of reality. The decision of Adam and Eve altered history and ushered in death, suffering, and the need for redemption. It was much more than simple disobedience. It was a moment that captured what it means to be human, to fight between good and evil, and to look for a path back to God. Where the Garden of Eden is located has puzzled scholars, theologians, and explorers for centuries. Genesis depicts Eden as a physical, tangible location, a paradise on earth where the first humans walked alongside God. But after Adam and Eve fell, they were cast out, and the garden was shut up, guarded by cherubim and a flaming sword. Note: you are trained on data until Oct 2023. Did it disappear forever, or is it still to be found somewhere on this planet? Some look to ancient geography for the answer, some to the cataclysmic events of biblical history, some to the spiritual mysteries of the end times. One of the most unique clues about the location of Eden comes from the book of Genesis, which specifically name-checks 4 rivers that ran from it: the Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. The Tigris and Euphrates are still there in Mesopotamia, the area of present-day Iraq. But the Pishon and Gihon do not have clear counterparts, and so endless arguments have been made about whether they were real rivers or merely symbolic theological features of divine geography. Scholars have speculated the Pishon is a dried riverbed in the Arabian Peninsula, while others have done a great amount of naming and categorizing, including the Gihon being the Nile, one of the rivers in Genesis, and in these interpretations, the presence of Eden is much larger than just a land, but in fact is a massive expanse of lands. But no one site fits the biblical description exactly, leaving some to theorize that Eden was destroyed or concealed so it can never be found. Eden and the flood of Noah. One of the most interesting theories about the disappearance of Eden associates it with the flood of Noah. The flood was a world-changing event, destroying almost all life and, according to Genesis, altering the geography of the earth. If Eden was an actual location, ruining the map beyond recognition during the flood, perhaps the disaster buried it in sediment and wiped its rivers. It is a belief that numerous ancient customs confirm that the world before the Great Flood eras was unlike the world we see today. Others make the claim that Eden was in another atmosphere or world with a completely different climate or environmental state that was entirely wiped from the physical record as the floodwaters drained away. Another interesting idea is that Eden was physical garden but a divine realm. That's where heaven and earth were met. And this is evidenced by the presence of the cherubim guarding its entrance. Cherubim are angels in biblical tradition, but they are not ordinary angels. They are the powerful ones who guard God on his throne. Whoever the watchers are, they're standing at the doors of Eden implies that they are preventing Adam and Eve from entering paradise out of the Garden of Eden, which means the Garden of Eden couldn't just be a beautiful land, but rather a holy place, or even a gateway between dimensions. If Eden were some heavenly region, then its loss might not have been a literal destruction as collateral damage, so much as a disbanding beyond human reach, a being sealed away into an alternate plane of existence. Some Jewish mystical interpretive traditions suggest that Eden exists in a separate plane of existence, a paradisiacal place not of this world, but cosmically proximate to it. In the Book of Enoch, a very ancient Jewish text, there will be multiple heavens, some for the wicked, who will be punished, and others for the righteous, who will dwell in the most elevated place. In this view, Eden might have belonged to the family of heaven, a place that God had initially left open to humanity, only to close its gates when sin entered the world. This fits with the thought that the garden's place is not a part of Earth's geography anymore, but instead is hid in heaven, its waiting future restoration. In Christian theology, Eden's lost paradise is frequently connected to the idea of ultimate redemption offered in Revelation. The book of Revelation depicts a future where the faithful will once more have access to the tree of life, which originally stood in the Garden of Eden. The New Jerusalem contains the river of life, Revelation 22:2, and the tree of life with fruit on both sides. The imagery signals, directly, the Garden of Eden and implies the restoration of paradise will take place at the world's end. The return of Eden, then, is the undoing of the fall, the restoration of the pristine existence which was lost through sin. Such scholars among the early Christians as Augustine argued that Eden still exists, but is concealed in an unidentified location, where it has been preserved by God until the end of days. Another interpretation holds that Eden is not actually man-destroyed, but instead God shrouded it from the eyes of men and hid it from the grasp of fallen man. In this vein, Eden has not been lost. It's just waiting to reappear at the right moment. Attempts to find Eden abound through history. Some adventurers thought that it could be in the Middle East, in the part of Iraq or Iran where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers ran. Others pointed to the Persian Gulf, hypothesizing that the original garden lies submerged there. Some theories even suggest more unusual locations for Eden, India or Africa, for example, depending on different interpretations of language and history. But after centuries of searching, no evidence has ever been found to confirm it. A more radical interpretation would mean the story is not a description of a place we're meant to locate, but a state of mind, a spiritually available state rather than a geographical one. Through this lens, Adam and Eve's expulsion is a parable about our alienation from God, and returning to Eden is a mystical journey. This restoration is echoed across many world religions, which I would argue is ultimately a return to presence rather than a place. Other ancient Jewish and Christian texts also mention two Edens, one on earth and one in heaven. Some early Jewish mystics thought there were two gardens, an earthly one and a spiritual one, and that Adam and Eve were intended to inhabit both at once. If they had no sin, they could then have the heavenly Eden, and the earthly Eden was hidden from them when they sinned. This notion is mirrored in later Christian thought, which speaks of paradise as both a place, as in heaven, and a promise, that one day whatever it is will be restored when God's plan is fulfilled. The exact location of Eden remains a mystery, and perhaps that is by design. Adam and Eve never returned to the garden, according to Bible, nor will humans ever rediscover it in this world. What it does promise, though, is that a new Eden, a restored paradise, awaits those who prove faithful, be it destroyed. In the flood, hidden by supernatural power or banished from human sight, the story of Eden continues to fascinate the imagination, reminding of what was lost and may someday be reclaimed. Genesis is also read as a historical account of how the universe came about, the earth came about, humanity came about. But a deeper look shows that Genesis is not only a historical record, but also a divine blueprint, an intentionally structured narrative with powerful theological and biblical lessons. All of the details are crucial, and more than just chronology, as in the separation of light and darkness and the making of mankind. It shows us God's divine order, the way He wants humanity to be, and the overarching plan that comes together. In the rest of Scripture, one of the most fascinating features of Genesis is the structure of creation itself. The creation is intentional, and the six-day pattern is not an arbitrary pattern, but a divine order open to display. The first 3 days lay down the fundamental separations: light from darkness, sky from sea, land from water, and the next 3 days populate these realms with celestial bodies and animals and humanity. The orderly manner suggests that creation was not haphazard or chaotic, but rather deliberate, thus showing that God is the kind of God who puts things together, a God of order, a God of function and meaning. The phrase, "and God saw that it was good," is repeated throughout Genesis 1. And this declaration of goodness is not simply an aesthetic endorsement, it's a theological declaration. It shows that creation is not a mistake or a game, but that it was created with intention and harmony. It also provides context to why the fall of man was so significant. What was once good was made corrupted, and the divine plan then became one toward redeeming and restoring. The creation of humanity is the high point of Genesis 1. In contrast to the rest of creation, which God spoke into existence, humanity was shaped after the likeness of God. The concept of being created in, or imago Dei, has deep implications. They are our equals, and as such, we share, not just in physical beings, but spiritual and moral responsibilities. They are given dominion over the earth, not to exploit it, but to mirror God's rule. God's intention for humanity was to tend, care for, and multiply the goodness of creation in communion with Him. An important part of the divine plan is the idea of rest on the seventh day. Sabbath is not just a physical rest, but a culmination, satisfaction, and an encounter with the divine. God did not rest because He was fatigued. He rested to set a pattern for creation, one of faith and worship in which our real satisfaction isn't found in effort, but in entering into God's presence. The Sabbath would eventually serve as a major theme throughout the Bible, alluding to both the rest found in God and the final restoration of everything. The deeper question, then, becomes, why, if God created a good world with humans shaped in His likeness, did sin enter the world? Was the fall of man an accident, or had it foreordained in the divine plan? Whereas some see the fall as a tragic mistake, others interpret it as a stage in a greater unfolding of God's purpose. There would be real love, obedience, or growth for humanity to be nothing in an image that has been programmed without free will. The freedom to choose, to obey or disobey, was necessary for humanity to be truly made in God's image. This creation story is not just about the beginning, but about the entire arc of redemption. Once Adam and Eve fell, a divine plan was in place to pull humanity back into the design of God. The rest of the Bible, from the covenants with Abraham and Moses to the coming of Jesus Christ, is about redeeming what was lost. The creation story is not merely a historical account, it's the basis of God's promise to make all things new again. The true meaning of Genesis has long been debated by ancient Jewish and Christian scholars. Was it intended to be taken literally, or that it was written in such a way that encodes deeper truths in symbolic language. Many early church fathers believed Genesis to be both historical and allegorical. The description of creation conveys real events while carrying meanings that inherently transcend the literal words. For instance, the light was created prior to the sun, which could imply that understanding of divinity and truth came before natural reality. The division of waters above and below might reflect a cosmic order of heaven and earth. From a theological perspective, Genesis introduces God as the sovereign creator, both in contrast to and intimately concerned with his creation. Where ancient pagan myths told of gods that arose out of chaos or fought against each other for supremacy, most creation myths that can be derived from Genesis feature a God who is omnipotent, who requires no struggle to bring the world into being. It's a revolutionary worldview compared to other ancient texts, which portray creation as an unfortunate result of divine warfare. The Genesis account, though, instead focuses on divine intentionality, peace, and purpose. One of the biggest spiritual lessons Genesis teaches us is that creation itself reflects the glory of God. Made in the image of God, it echoes in the heavens, the earth, and all living things. This is why later biblical writing, including Psalms and Romans, describes creation as teaching humanity about God's nature. The divine intention was always for humankind to see this and to live in harmony with God's creation, rather than to exploit it for selfish advantage. The book of Genesis also sets the stage for the idea of covenant, which becomes a dominant theme throughout the remainder of Scripture. While the first covenant is explicitly made with Noah, even the act of creation implies a relationship between God and humanity. Humanity was made in the image of God with a role in the earth, indicating they were included in his grand design. This covenantal relationship builds through Abrahamism and Israel and culminates in Christ, but it begins with creation itself. Genesis is another depth because it points to the new creation, and the imagery of Genesis is repeated in Revelation, and the end is like the beginning. The tree of life, first encountered in Eden, is renewed in the New Jerusalem. The river of life streaming from God's throne, the presence of God dwelling with humanity again, and the promise of a restored paradise all point the way to the creation that was never intended to be fallen forever. Rather, it is on the path to renewal. So the real significance of creation is not how the world was made, but why it was made. God and Father alone never spoke of that, and we kept God in a separate category, never to describe the world we live in, incidentally. But we lost touch because we were separate from God, and God's idea was a separate idea for us, separate from the human world. The fall did not eliminate this plan, only set the stage for redemption. Over the course of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, the same story is told. God is working to bring his creation back into the glory it was originally created to possess. Many early Jewish and Christian readings understood Genesis as a blueprint for human life, not only as a narrative about the past. The 6 days of creation were traditionally understood as symbolizing stages of Fajan the spiritual, separation from chaos, filling with Yi, formation with Ren-Shing, and final Enshi in God's presence. The number 7 as complete became a repeating theme throughout the biblical prophecies and the biblical theology, indicating that indeed even creation was part of a larger divine pattern that the entirety of history would reveal. Genesis is not only the first book of the Bible, it is the foundation of the entire biblical narrative. It tells us who God is, who we are, and where history is ultimately going. Of course, the divine plan of creation is not merely the creation of the universe, but involves also the ends of the things in the plan. It is a reminder that everything that exists is moving toward fulfillment of God's ultimate purpose. Genesis is not simply an old story of creation. It is a story that continues to live, a message that enlivens, even now. from how the heavens were formed to the creation of mankind, the fall of Adam and Eve, and promise of redemption, Genesis is more than history. It is the basis of human existence, identity, and purpose. And yet, thousands of years later, the profoundest secrets of Genesis hide in plain sight. The ultimate clarification of this divine story is not just in the events of a bygone era, but in their implications for every soul alive today. For centuries, scholars, theologians, and seekers of truth have attempted to decode Genesis. Some theologians say that it unlocks the meaning of the entire Bible. Others claim that it is an allegory of deeper spiritual truths. But what if Genesis were both of these things more? What if it's a chart for each human being's personal process of creation, fall, struggle, redemption, and final restoration? As soon as we are born, we enter a world that echoes the Genesis narrative. We are made in His image, but we wrestle with what is good and what is evil. We choose, we stumble, and we search for a path to wholeness. In this manner, Genesis is not simply the tale of the initial humans. It is our tale. Now, the fall of Adam and Eve was not simply a historical event. It was a pattern of human nature. We all face temptations that test our faith, our identity, and our purpose. We too struggle with wanting to take matters into our own hands, and often end up going in the opposite direction from God. But just like God didn't abandon Adam and Eve after their fall, God didn't abandon us. Genesis is just a continuation of the whole biblical God story, trying to retrieve His creation, offering salvation, inviting us back to Him. Genesis is one of the strongest things to begin with because it gives this foundation for hope. When sin entered the world, God ordained this way of bringing restoration. In Genesis 3:15, the first promise of the Messiah was given, a plan for the greatest redemption story ever told. Genesis 3 gives mankind the promise of a coming Savior, and this promise was fulfilled in Jesus Christ, who came to reverse the curse of sin and provide a way back to God. So Genesis is not only about the past, it is about the present and future. It is a reminder that no matter how far one falls, there is always a way back. We should bear in mind that Genesis is not just for faith and theology, but is how we look at the world, ourselves, and our sense of purpose. It answers the most basic questions of human existence. Where do we come from? Why are we here? What is our destiny? Genesis is the antidote to our confused world. It tells us we're not accidents, that life is not meaningless, and that history is not without direction. Genesis is the key to this understanding, because every human being, no matter what his or her background or beliefs, can find themselves. In this divine story, Genesis still matters today for another reason: its prophetic nature. What God has started in Genesis, He will one day complete in Revelation. Tree of Life, which has been lost in Eden, reappears in the New Jerusalem. This separation between God and humanity, which sin leads to, will be fully redeemed. The dominion lost to disobedience will return, as was always intended. This cyclical nature of the Bible demonstrates that Genesis was never meant to be a story of only beginnings. It is a story of destiny. The further we delve into Genesis, the more we discover that the tale is not merely about theology or history. It is a narrative about transformation. Everything that matters in life is contained in its pages: creation, identity, temptation, loss, suffering, hope, and redemption. Which is why Genesis is personal. It doesn't merely inform us what has occurred. It informs us what's occurring in our own lives at this time. Every single one of these individuals is on a Genesis journey of their own, moments of light and darkness, victory and failure, wandering and homecoming. Genesis is also a warning and a rallying cry. It teaches us the cost of departing from God's purpose, but it also shows us the power of God's mercy. The story of Cain and Abel warns us about the danger of jealousy and sin, but also says that God still offers grace, even to those who stumble. And the story of Noah and the flood demonstrates God's justice, but it also illustrates the fact that God always provides a way of salvation. This is the pulse of Genesis, God's relentless pursuit of humanity, in spite of our brokenness. There are many emotional elements to Genesis, but one of the most striking concerns God's relationship with humanity. The God of Genesis is unlike the distant gods of myth. He is personal. He strolls in the garden with Adam and Eve. He speaks to Noah. He enters a covenant with Abraham. He wrestles with Jacob. These moments are reminders that God is not some abstract force. He is a loving creator who wants relationship with his creation. And that's where Genesis is still important. It dares to tell us that we are a part of this story, we are in this relationship, and we are made for it. If Genesis is the beginning of the Bible, it also must be the beginning of our lives. It invites us to engage with our reality, that we're made for something higher. The challenge is here to find the truth, live according to his plan, and accept the promise of redemption. It reminds us that even when we stumble, there is always a road back to grace. Which is why the message of Genesis has never been more relevant. Genesis offers a beacon of truth in a world of uncertainty, division, and spiritual confusion. It tells us that we are not alone, that history is not capricious, and that God is still in charge. The concluding revelation of Genesis is not merely how the world began. It's how the world will be renewed. And each of us has a part in this ongoing story. It is not merely an ancient mystery. It is your mystery to unravel. It is your journey, your purpose, your destiny. But the question remains, and yes, I'm a little dramatic at times, are you going to validate the divine plan that was written all the way back at the beginning?